from George Ivanovich Gurdjieff's All and Everything. Chapter 42, Beelzebub in America. Reading 2. And now, my boy, maintaining the form of mentation of our dear teacher, I might as well tell you also a little about the speech of these American beings. You must know that before my arrival on that continent, I could already speak the tongue of the beings of that continent, namely what is called the English tongue. But from the very first day of my arrival in the capital of this North America, I already experienced great inconvenience in my verbal intercourse, because, as it turned out, although these beings use this English tongue for verbal intercourse among themselves, this English tongue of theirs is rather special and, in fact, quite peculiar. So, having felt the inconvenience, I made up my mind to learn this peculiar conversational English of theirs also. On the third day after my arrival there, as I was on my way to my newly acquainted Mr., specially to ask him to recommend me a teacher for this English tongue, I suddenly saw, reflected on the sky by projectors, an American advertisement with the words, "School of Languages by the System of Mr. XLII, 13 North 293rd Street. The languages and the times when they were taught were set forth, and of the American English language in particular, it was stated, among other things, that it could be learned in from 5 minutes to 24 hours. At first I could not make head or tail of it, but I decided all the same to go the next morning to the address indicated. When the next day I found this Mr. XLII, he received me himself in person, and when he heard that I wished to learn the American English language by his system, he explained to me first of all that this conversational language could be learned by his system in 3 forms, each form corresponding to some special requirement. The first form, he said, is the conversational language for a man who is obliged to earn here among us our American dollars. The second form is required for a man who, although not in need of our dollars, nevertheless likes to do dollar business, and furthermore, in order that in his social relations with our Americans, everybody will think that he is not just a nobody, but a real gentleman with an English upbringing. As for the third form of the English language, this form is required by anybody who wishes to be able to procure, here, there, and everywhere, and at any hour, Scotch whiskey. As the time for learning the second form of the English language by this system suited me best, I decided to pay him immediately the dollars he charged in order to know the secret of his system. When I had paid him the dollars he charged, and he had, seemingly quite casually, but in reality not without that avidity which has also already become proper to all the beings of your planet, placed my dollars in an inside pocket, he explained to me that in order to learn this second form, only 5 words had to be memorized, namely, maybe, perhaps, tomorrow, oh, I see, all right. He added that if I had occasion to converse with one or more of their misters, I should only need to utter any one of these 5 words every now and then. That will be quite enough, he added, to convince everybody that in the first place you know the English language very well, and secondly that you are an old hand at doing dollar business. Although the system of this highly esteemed XLII was very original and meritorious, yet I never had occasion to put it into practice. And the occasion did not arise, because the next day I met by chance in the street an old acquaintance, and, as he is called, editor from the continent of Europe, who in conversation confided to me an even more ideal secret for the American language. When I told him, among other things, that I had been the day before to Mr. XLII about the local language, and had told him a little about the system, he replied, "Do you know what, my dear doctor? As you are a subscriber to our paper over there, I cannot help revealing to you a certain secret of the language here." And he said further, "Knowing several of our European languages, you can, by employing this secret of mine, be master of the language here to perfection, and indeed converse about anything you wish, and not simply make others think that you know the English language, for which purpose, I do not deny, the system of this XLII is indeed excellent." He explained further that if, when pronouncing any word taken from any European language, you imagine that you have a hot potato in your mouth, then some word of the English language is in general bound to result. And if you imagine that this same hot potato is furthermore well sprinkled with ground red pepper, then you will already have the pronunciation of the local American English language to a T. He advised me, moreover, not to be timid in choosing words from the European languages, since the English language in general consisted of a fortuitous concourse of almost all the European languages, and hence that the language contained several words for every ordinary idea, with the consequence that you almost always hit on the right word. And suppose that, without knowing it, you use a word entirely absent from this language, no great harm is done. At worst, your hearer will only think that he himself is ignorant of it. All you have to do is just to bear in mind the said hot potato, and no more baloney about it. I guarantee this secret, and I can safely say that if, on exactly following my advice, your language here does not prove to be ideal, then you may stop your subscription. Several days later, I had to go to the city of Chicago. This city is the second in size on that continent, and is, as it were, a second capital of North America. On seeing me off for Chicago, that Mr., my New York acquaintance, gave me a letter of introduction to a certain Mr. there. As soon as I arrived in this city, Chicago, I went straight to this said Mr. This Chicago Mr. turned out to be very amiable and most obliging. His name was Mr. Bellybutton. For the evening of the first day, this amiable and obliging Mr. Bellybutton suggested my accompanying him to the house of some of his friends, so that, as he expressed it, I should not be bored in a quite strange city. I, of course, agreed. When we arrived, we found there a fair number of young American beings, guests like ourselves. All the guests were exceedingly gay and very merry. They were telling funny stories in turn, and the laughter from these stories of theirs lingered in the room like the smoke on a day when the wind is south over the chimneys of the American factories where the American sausages called hot dogs are prepared. As I also find funny stories amusing, that first evening of mine in the city of Chicago passed very gaily indeed. All this would have been quite sensible and very delightful if it had not been for one feature of the stories told that first evening, which greatly astonished and perplexed me. And that is, I was astonished by their what is called ambiguity and obscenity. The ambiguity and obscenity of these stories were such that any single one of these American storytellers could have given a dozen points to Boccaccio, famous there on the planet Earth. Boccaccio is the name of a certain writer who wrote for the beings of the earth a very instructive book called the Decameron. It is very widely read there at the present time, and is the favorite of contemporary beings breeding there on all continents and belonging to almost all communities there. The following day, also in the evening, this kind Mr. Bellybutton took me again to some still other friends of his. Here also were a large number of young American beings, both male and female, sitting in various corners of a very large room, conversing quietly and very placidly. When we were seated, a pretty young American girl soon came and sat down beside me and began chatting with me. As is usual there, I took up the conversation, and we chatted about anything and everything, she asking me, among other things, many questions about the city of Paris. In the midst of the conversation, this American, as they say, young lady, suddenly, for no earthly reason at all, began stroking my neck. I immediately thought, how kind of her. She must certainly have noticed a flea on my neck, and is now stroking the place to allay the irritation. But when I soon noticed that all the young American beings present were also stroking each other, I was much astonished and could not understand what it was all about. My first supposition concerning the fleas no longer held good, because it was impossible to suppose that everybody had a flea on his neck. I began speculating what it was all about, but try as I might, I could give myself no explanation whatever. Only afterwards, when we had left the house and were in the street, I asked Mr. Bellybutton for an explanation of it all. He immediately burst into unrestrained laughter, and called me a simpleton and a hick. Then, calming down a bit, he said, "What a queer guy you are! Why, we have just been to a petting party." And still laughing at my naivety, he explained that the day before we had also been to a party, but to a story party. "And tomorrow," he continued, "I was planning to take you to a swimming party, where young people bathe together, but of course all dressed in special costumes." When he saw that the same look of perplexed astonishment still remained on my face, he asked, "But if for some reason or other you don't like such tame affairs, we can go to others that are not open to everybody. There are lots of such parties here, and I am a member of several of them. At these parties, which are not open to everybody, we can, if you like, have something more substantial." But I did not take advantage of this kindness of this obliging and exceedingly amiable Mr. Bellybutton, because the next morning I received a telegram which made it necessary for me to return to New York. At this point of his tales, Beelzebub suddenly became thoughtful, and after a rather protracted pause, sighing deeply, he continued to speak thus. "The next day I did not go by the morning train, as I had decided on receiving the telegram, but delayed my departure until the night train. As the cause of the delay of my departure may well illustrate for you the evil resulting from a certain invention of these American beings, which is very widely spread over the whole of your planet, and which is one of the chief causes of the continued, so to say, dwindling of the psyche of all the other three-brained beings of your unfortunate planet, I shall tell you about it a little more in detail. Just this maleficent invention of the beings of this continent, which I now intend to explain to you, has not only been the cause of the acceleration of the tempo of the still greater dwindling of the psyche of all the three-brained beings breeding on that unfortunate planet of yours, but it was and still is the cause also that in the beings of all the other continents of recent times there is already completely destroyed that being function which it is proper for all three-brained beings to have, and which was the one single function which even until the last century arose in their presence of its own accord, namely, that being function which is everywhere called the sane instinct to believe in reality. In the place of this function, very necessary for every three-brained being, another special, very definite function gradually crystallized, whose action induces in its bearer a continuous doubt about everything. This maleficent invention of theirs they call advertising. Better to understand what follows, I must first tell you that several years before this trip of mine to America, once when traveling on the continent of Europe, I bought myself some books to read in the train to pass away the prospective long and tedious railway journey. In one of these books, written by a very famous writer there, I read an article about this America, in which a great deal was said about what is called the slaughterhouses existing in that same city, Chicago. Slaughterhouse is the name there for a special place where three-brained terrestrial beings carry on the destruction of the existence of those beings of various other forms whose planetary bodies they are addicted to, using for their first being food, again owing to those abnormally established conditions of ordinary being existence. Moreover, executing this manifestation of theirs, in these special establishments, they even say and imagine that they do it from necessity, and as it were, in a perfectly what they call humane way. The said terrestrial, contemporary, very famous writer, the author of this book, rapturously described as an eyewitness a, in his opinion, superlatively well-organized slaughterhouse of this same city, Chicago. He described the perfection of its machines of every possible kind and its marvelous cleanliness. Not only, he wrote, does humaneness to the beings of other forms reach in this slaughterhouse the degree of divinity, but even the machines are so perfected that it is almost as if a live ox is driven through a door at one end, and some 10 minutes later, out of a door at the other end, you could get, if you wished, hot sausages ready to eat. Finally, he specially emphasized that it was all done entirely by the perfected machines alone, without the touch of a human hand. As a consequence of which, as he said, everything was so clean and neat there that nothing could possibly be imagined cleaner and neater. Several years after reading that book, I chanced to read again almost the same thing about this Chicago slaughterhouse in a certain, also serious Russian magazine, in which this slaughterhouse was lauded in the same way. And thereafter I heard of this Chicago slaughterhouse from 1,000 different beings, many of whom had been presumably eyewitnesses to the marvels they described. In short, before my arrival in the city of Chicago, I was already fully convinced that a marvel unprecedented on the earth existed there. I must mention here that I had always been greatly interested in these establishments of theirs, namely, those places where your favorites destroy the existence of various forms of terrestrial beings. And furthermore, from the time when I began organizing my observatory on the planet Mars, and had to do with various machines for it, I took always and everywhere a great interest in every other sort of machine as well. So, when I happened to be in this same city of Chicago, I thought it would be inexcusable on my part not to use the opportunity to see this famous Chicago slaughterhouse. So, in the morning, on the day of my departure from there, I decided to go, accompanied by one of my new Chicago acquaintances, to inspect this rare construction of your favorites. Having arrived there, we took as our guide, on the advice of one of the assistants of the chief director, an employee of a branch of some bank there, which was connected with this slaughterhouse, and together with him we set off to inspect the place. Accompanied by him, we first of all went through the places where the unfortunate quadruped beings are driven, and where they remain until their slaughter. This place was in no way different from that of all establishments of the kind on your planet, except that this particular place was on a considerably larger scale. On the other hand, it was very much dirtier than any of the slaughterhouses I had previously seen in other countries. Afterwards, we went through several more what are called annexes. One of them was the cold storage for the meat that was ready. In another, they destroyed the existence of quadruped beings simply with hammers, and also stripped off their hide, again in the manner usual in other slaughterhouses. By the way, in passing through this last annex, I remember I then thought, this place here is, in all probability, for the slaughter of cattle, intended especially for the Jews, who, as I already knew, in accordance with the code of their religion, destroy quadruped beings in a special way. Walking through the said annexes took rather a long time, and all the while I was waiting for the moment when we should eventually arrive at the section about which I had heard so much, and which I was determined to see without fail. But when I expressed my wish to our guide to hasten on to that section, I learned that we had already seen everything there was to see in this famous Chicago slaughterhouse, and that no other sections existed. I had not, my dear boy, seen there anywhere a single machine, unless one includes the rollers on rails, which are in all slaughterhouses for moving the heavy carcasses. And as for the dirt in this Chicago slaughterhouse, you could see as much as you liked. In cleanliness and general organization, the slaughterhouse of the city Tiflis, which I had seen 2 years before, could have given many points to this slaughterhouse of the city Chicago. In the Tiflis slaughterhouse, for example, you would not find anywhere on the floor a single drop of blood, whereas in the Chicago slaughterhouse, everywhere, at every step, there were pools of it. Obviously, some company of American businessmen, inevitably resorting to advertising for every business in general, had to advertise the Chicago slaughterhouse also, in order to spread a false notion about it, totally unrelated to reality, over the whole planet. As is in general the rule there, they certainly did not spare their dollars in this case either, and since the sacred being function of conscience is completely atrophied among contemporary terrestrial, what are called journalists and reporters, the result is that in all your favorites breeding on all the continents, there is crystallized just that definite, monstrously exaggerated notion of the slaughterhouses of the city of Chicago. And it can be said indeed that they did so in true American fashion. On the continent America, the three-brained beings have become so expert in this advertising of theirs that it is quite possibly to apply to them the saying of our dear Mullah Nasser ad-Din, which declares that man will become a friend of the cloven-hoofed, who perfects himself to such reason and such being that he can make an elephant out of a fly. They have indeed become so skillful at making elephants out of flies, and they do it so often, that already at the present time, on seeing a genuine American elephant, one has to remember oneself with the whole of one's being, not to get the impression that it is only a fly. From Chicago I returned again to New York, and as all my projects, for the fulfillment of which I had come to this continent, were then unexpectedly, rapidly, and rather successfully actualized, and seeing that the surrounding circumstances and conditions of the ordinary existence of the three-brained beings of that city turned out to be corresponding to what was required for my periodic, complete rest, which had already become customary for me during my last personal sojourn on the surface of your planet, I decided to stay there longer and exist with the beings there merely according to the being associations inevitably flowing in me. Existing in the said way, in this central point of the beings of this big contemporary group, and rubbing shoulders on various occasions with the various types among them, I just then, without any premeditation, but thanks only to my acquired habit of collecting material, so to say, by the way, for those statistics of mine, which, as I have already told you, I gathered during the whole of my last personal sojourn among your favorites, for the purpose chiefly of comparing the extent to which all the illnesses and all the strange what are called being subjective vices existing among the beings of the different groups are spread, I constated a fact which greatly interested me, namely, the fact that in the common presences of almost half of all the three-brained beings I met there, the proceeding functioning of the transformation of the first being food is disharmonized. That is, as they themselves would say, their digestive organs are spoiled, and that almost a quarter of them have or are candidates for that form of disease specific to beings there, which they call impotence, thanks just to which disease a great many of the contemporary beings of your planet are forever deprived of the possibility of continuing their species. When I chanced to constate this, a great interest in the beings of just this new group arose in me, and I thereupon changed my previously determined mode of existence among them, and allotted half my time from my personal rest to special observation and investigation of the causes of this fact, for me so strange and for them so deplorable. In pursuit of this aim, I even took occasion to visit various other provincial points of the beings of this new contemporary group, though I stayed nowhere more than 1 or 2 days, with the exception of the city Boston, or, as it is sometimes called, the city of the people who escaped race degeneration. There I existed for a whole week. And so, as a result of these observations and statistical investigations of mine, it became clear that both these aforesaid diseases, which to a certain extent are prevalent among the contemporary beings in general, who breed on all continents, are on this continent so inordinately widespread that its proximate consequences were immediately patent to me, namely, that if it continues among them at the present rate, then just the same fate will befall this contemporary large independent group of three-brained beings who have taken your fancy, as recently befell that large community there which was called monarchic Russia. That is to say, this group also will be destroyed. The difference will be only in the process of the destruction itself. The process of the destruction of the large community, monarchic Russia, proceeded in consequence of the abnormalities of, so to say, the reason of the power-possessing beings there, whereas the process of the destruction of this community America will proceed in consequence of organic abnormalities. In other words, the death of the first community came from, as they say, the mind, whereas the death of the second community will come from the stomach and sex of its beings. The point is that it has long ago been determined that in general the possibility of long existence for a three-brained being of your planet depends at the present time exclusively only on the normal action of these two aforementioned being functions, namely, upon the state of their, as they say, digestion, and upon the functioning of their sex organs. But it is precisely these two functionings necessary to their common presence, which are now both going in the direction of complete atrophy, and moreover, at a highly accelerated tempo. The community America is at the present time still quite young. It is still, as they say there on your planet, like an infant, all peaches and cream. And so, if while still so young, its beings have in respect of the two chief motors of their existence thus deviated retrogressively, then, in my opinion, in this case also, as it in general occurs to everything in the megalocosmos, the degree of the further movement for the purpose of blending again with the infinite will depend on the direction and degree of the forces obtained from the initial impetus. In our great megalocosmos, there is even established for all beings with reason a law, as it were, according to which one must always and in everything guard just against the initial impetus, because on acquiring momentum, it becomes a force which is the fundamental mover of everything existing in the universe, and which leads everything back to prime being. In this place of his tales, Beelzebub was handed a Leidechambros, and when he had finished listening to the contents of the communication, he turned again to Hassien and said, "I think, my boy, that it will be very useful to you for your more detailed representation and understanding of the strangeness of the psyche in general of these three-brained beings who have taken your fancy, and who arise on the planet Earth, if I explain to you in somewhat greater detail the causes which, in the common presences of these American three-brained beings, produce disharmony in both of these fundamental functionings of theirs."